Angel of death. It's a chilling phrase, right? You don't exactly picture someone working in healthcare when you hear that.
Right.
But that's what makes Donald Harvey's case so disturbing. This guy, a seemingly ordinary hospital orderly,
Hmm.
turned out to be one of America's most prolific serial killers, responsible for something like 87 deaths over nearly 2 decades.
Yeah, it's a tough one to wrap your head around.
It really is. And that's why we're diving into his world today with the help of John Douglas's book, The Killer Across the Table.
Right, book.
For our listeners who aren't familiar, Douglas was a legendary FBI profiler. And, well, the insights he offers into the criminal mind are just incredible.
Absolutely. He's the pioneer in so many ways.
So we're going to use his expertise today to try to understand how Harvey operated undetected for so long.
Sounds good.
We're going to be unpacking some pretty disturbing stuff, his methods, the psychology behind his crimes, and what lessons we can learn from this case. But first, let's start with Harvey's early life. Now, you might be surprised to hear this, but it wasn't the typical, troubled childhood story we often associate with serial killers.
Yeah, that's one of the things that makes Harvey's case so intriguing and, well, so unsettling.
Right.
There wasn't a clear history of, like, overt abuse or trauma that you see with a lot of these guys. On the surface, his childhood seemed pretty normal.
So, no red flags for those around him. Like, how does a seemingly normal kid become a serial killer?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Evil can hide in plain sight. And psychopathy, as Douglas explains, isn't always outwardly obvious.
You're right.
It's often about, well, a deep-seated lack of empathy, a manipulative nature, that kind of thing. And that can be incredibly difficult to detect, especially in a child.
So you're saying even if someone had been looking for signs, they might not have seen them?
It's possible, yeah. But having said that, when you look closer at Harvey's youth, some disturbing patterns do emerge. Little things that maybe should raise more concern.
Douglas mentioned some specifics in the book, right? What were some of those early signs?
Oh yeah, there are a few key things that stand out. A fascination with death, instances of cruelty to animals, the lack of empathy we touched on earlier, and a strong desire to control others, to sort of exert his will.
Okay, so these are all pretty troubling signs on their own.
Right.
But most kids go through phases, right? Like maybe they're into dark stuff for a while, but it doesn't mean they'll become a serial killer.
Exactly. It's not about labeling every kid who's into, spooky stuff as a potential psychopath. It's about recognizing patterns, about looking for clusters of these traits. When you see a bunch of them together, that's when you start to worry.
It's almost like seeing those little cracks in a bridge, you know?
Oh.
You might not realize the danger at first, but they're signs of a much larger structural problem.
That's a great analogy. And that's what we're talking about here. Those early cracks that, if left unchecked, can lead to a total collapse.
Okay, so we're starting to see some troubling signs in Harvey's early life. Then things take a truly dark turn when he begins working in hospitals.
Yeah.
It's almost like, giving a wolf the keys to the sheep pen.
Oh, that's a chillingly accurate analogy.
Uh-huh.
As an orderly, Harvey had access to vulnerable patients. And, I mean, think about the power dynamic there, right? People who are already sick, in pain, they're trusting him for care. It's a situation ripe for exploitation, especially by someone with a predatory mindset.
And exploded, he did. I mean, the methods Harvey used are as varied as they are disturbing. Poisoning, suffocation, even tampering with medical equipment.
Yeah.
Douglas actually describes this one instance where Harvey messed with a patient's ventilator settings, causing them to slowly suffocate. I mean, how do you even fathom that level of premeditation, the calculated cruelty? Why choose these methods specifically? Was it just about inflicting pain?
I don't think so. It goes deeper than that. These methods, as horrific as they are, they were also very effective in hiding his crimes. Poisoning, for example, can easily be mistaken for natural causes, especially in a busy hospital. It's chaotic. Things get missed.
So he was using his knowledge of the hospital environment to his advantage.
Exactly. He knew how to blend in, how to make his actions seem like, just another unfortunate medical complication.
It's terrifying to think that someone could intentionally be harming patients, and everyone just thinks it's, part of the job.
It really is. And that's why this case is so important to study, because it highlights the vulnerabilities that exist within systems that we generally trust.
I mean, was that part of his motivation at all, this desire to outsmart everyone, to be the puppet master pulling the strings?
Oh, absolutely. The thrill of deception, as Douglas calls it, was a major factor for Harvey. He reveled in the fact that he was operating under the radar, fooling everyone.
Right.
Doctors, nurses, investigators.
It wasn't just about that act of killing itself, it was about the game.
Exactly. The challenge of getting away with it. And that feeds into another crucial aspect of Harvey's psychology. This need for power and control.
Right, we touched on that earlier.
Well, for him, the victims were almost arbitrary. It wasn't about specific targets or, personal vendettas. It was about the act of control itself, deciding who lived and who died. That was the ultimate power trip for him.
That's chilling. It makes his crime seem even more, I don't know, meaningless in a way. Like these people died simply because he wanted to feel powerful.
That's the disturbing truth of it. It challenges our traditional understanding of motive,
Mm.
We want to believe there's a clear reason, a specific target, but with Harvey, it seems the motive was the power itself.
It's hard to wrap your head around on that, but we have to try. So how did investigators finally catch up with him? What was the key that unlocked this whole horrifying puzzle?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. Harvey's downfall wasn't some, dramatic showdown or a confession out of the blue. It was something far more mundane, something you might not expect. But I guess we'll have to save that for after the break.
All right, we'll be back in a moment to dive deeper into the world of Donald Harvey. Stay with us. Okay, so right before the break, we were about to learn how they finally caught Donald Harvey. And you were saying it wasn't some big dramatic event.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising, actually. Not a chase or a shootout, nothing like that.
Okay, so what was it?
It was a tiny little detail, almost insignificant. A single entry in a patient's chart.
Wait, what? A chart entry? How could that?
I know, right? Sounds crazy. But that's what unraveled this whole thing.
So, did someone notice Harvey acting suspicious and then go check the chart?
No, not quite. It was a hospital worker, sharp-eyed, noticed something just a little bit off about the entry, just didn't match up with the patient's actual symptoms. Thankfully, they had the intuition to flag it, went with their gut.
So that one little thing that could have been easily missed.
Exactly.
It's like that saying, the devil's in the details, but in this case, it was the angel of death.
Yeah, you could say that. So that little discrepancy, that's what sparked the investigation.
Yeah.
And the more they dug, the more inconsistencies they found. And eventually, all those inconsistencies pointed right back to Harvey.
So they finally confront him, and what? Does he deny everything?
Nope, not at all. Actually, he confessed pretty readily, and not just to a few incidents. Harvey admitted to an unbelievable 87 murders. 87.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that number. Like, the scale of it is just...
Unfathomable, right.
Yeah, it's just chilling. The impact on the victims' families, the hospital staff, the whole community.
Oh, absolutely. It's a wound that runs deep, and it really forced the medical community to take a long, hard look at itself. The Harvey case exposed all these vulnerabilities in hospital security, hiring practices. It highlighted the inherent trust we place in healthcare workers, a trust that, in this case, was tragically violated.
I remember reading about hospitals implementing stricter background checks, security measures, all that. Was the Harvey case a driving force behind those changes?
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. It was a wake-up call. It forced hospitals to take a proactive approach to patient safety, accountability, things that maybe weren't given enough attention before.
There's this misconception out there that some of Harvey's killings were mercy killings, that he was putting people out of their misery. But Douglas, he debunks that pretty firmly in his book, right?
Absolutely. It's a dangerous myth. True euthanasia, it involves consent, compassion, a deep understanding of the patient's wishes. You see none of that in Harvey's actions.
So this wasn't about ending suffering.
No. It was about power, control. He was playing God, deciding who lived and who died. Not out of mercy, but out of this twisted need to control.
That really underscores the importance of Douglas's psychological profile of Harvey, doesn't it? The need for power and control, the psychological dissociation, the thrill of deception. These are all such crucial pieces of the puzzle.
Right. You can't understand Harvey without understanding those core elements of his personality. They drive everything he did.
We've talked about the power and control aspect, but what about the psychological dissociation? How did that allow him to do what he did, to disconnect from the horror of it all?
Well, think of it as a coping mechanism, but in a really distorted way. Harvey was able to compartmentalize his actions. He could disconnect from the human cost, the suffering. It was like he built this wall in his mind, convinced himself that he was helping these patients, that they were better off dead.
So not a raving lunatic then, more like a cold, calculating...
Manipulator. Someone who built their own reality, where their actions made sense. A warped reality, but his nonetheless.
That's what makes this case so disturbing. He wasn't some monster in the shadows. He was right there, in the open. Someone trusted, blended right in. And that's a really unsettling thought.
Absolutely. It challenges the way we think about evil. Makes you realize it can be so much closer than we think.
So Harvey died in prison a few years back, but this case, it's still so relevant, right? Like, what are the lasting lessons, the things we can learn from this dark chapter to help us recognize, maybe even prevent something like this from happening again?
Well, one of the biggest things for me is the power of observation. We have to be attuned to the details, the little things that might be a sign of something bigger, those inconsistencies, the things that just don't quite add up.
It's like that saying again, the devil's in the details. But this time, it's about protecting ourselves, recognizing the potential for darkness before it's too late.
Exactly. And it's not just about potential criminals, right? It's about recognizing unhealthy patterns in our own lives, relationships, the way we interact with the world.
So being more aware of the subtle signs, listening to our gut when something feels off.
Right. Because sometimes those seemingly small things, those are the clues that can lead us to safety, to justice. We have to be willing to see them, to act on them. That's how we protect ourselves and each other.
And it's about having those difficult conversations, isn't it? Speaking up when something feels wrong, even if it's uncomfortable.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
Silence can be complicit. We need to create a culture where people feel safe to speak up, where we challenge authority, advocate for ourselves and for others. That's how we build a world where cases like Donald Harvey's are less likely to happen. A world where we're all a little bit safer, a little bit more aware.
That's a powerful message. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the chilling world of Donald Harvey, the Angel of Death. It's a sobering reminder that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places, wearing the most ordinary masks. But it's also a call to action. A reminder that we all have a role to play in creating a world where such darkness has less power to take hold. So thank you for joining us on this unsettling but important journey. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into a fascinating topic. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.
So we've been talking about Donald Harvey, this really chilling case. And before we went to break, it was starting to get kind of heavy. But I think what we need to do now is shift gears a bit, talk about solutions. Like, how can people protect themselves? What can we learn from Harvey's story to, I don't know, maybe even prevent something like this happening again?
Yeah, that's the important thing, right? To take something away from all of this darkness. And it's not easy. I mean, how do you guard against someone like Harvey? Someone who can
Yeah.
blend in so well?
Right. He wasn't some like stereotypical monster. He was a seemingly ordinary guy who was able to deceive everyone around him. Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be aware of the more subtle signs, the things that might not scream danger, but should definitely raise a red flag.
So what are we talking about here? Like, beyond the obvious, cruelty to animals and that sort of thing, what are some less obvious signs that someone might be hiding a dark side?
Well, one thing to look for is patterns of manipulation. Does this person lie a lot, even about small things? Do they constantly try to control situations to get their way? Yeah. Those are signs that something might be off.
So it's not just about like one big dramatic event. It's about noticing those smaller, more consistent patterns of behavior.
Exactly. Because those patterns, those can reveal a lot about a person's true nature.
And what about like gut feelings? I've always been told to trust my gut. If someone makes me feel uncomfortable, there's probably a reason for that, right?
Absolutely. Our instincts are incredibly powerful. They've evolved over thousands of years to help us detect danger. So if someone makes you feel uneasy, don't ignore that feeling, even if you can't quite explain why you feel that way.
Okay, so let's say you do notice some red flags. Maybe you're seeing those patterns of manipulation, or you just have a bad feeling about someone. What's the next step? Because I think a lot of people might be hesitant to speak up, especially if it involves confronting someone who's in a position of authority.
Yeah, I understand that. It can be really scary to speak up, especially when you're dealing with someone who's manipulative or intimidating. But it's so important to remember that silence only protects the abuser.
Right.
So if you're feeling unsafe or uncomfortable, find someone you trust, a friend, a family member, a therapist. Talk to them about what's going on. They can offer support and help you figure out the best course of action.
And if the situation calls for it, you should report it to the authorities, right?
Absolutely. There are systems in place to protect people, but those systems can only work if we use them. And remember, it was a single hospital worker who noticed that discrepancy in the patient's chart. That one person's observation, their willingness to speak up, that's what ultimately led to Harvey's arrest.
It's a powerful reminder that we all have a role to play in creating a safer world. We can't just sit back and wait for someone else to take action. We have to be willing to be those vigilant eyes, those voices that speak up against injustice.
Exactly. It's about being aware of the potential for darkness, but also believing in our own power to make a difference, to protect ourselves and to protect each other.
Well, that's a pretty powerful message to end on. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the chilling world of Donald Harvey, the Angel of Death, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. Evil can hide in plain sight, but so can courage. So let's all be a little more courageous. Let's be those vigilant eyes, those voices that speak truth to power. Because when we do that, we make the world a little bit safer for everyone.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay safe.